What if one moment, a glance, a smile, a conversation, was all it took to question everything you thought you knew about yourself? I didn't go looking for trouble. Honestly, I didn't even realize it when it began. It wasn't a grand, romantic gesture or some dramatic revelation. It was subtle. Almost too subtle. Just an ordinary moment that became the spark for something extraordinary and deeply, deeply complicated. I was 42, married to a man I loved, at least, I thought I did. We had built a life together, a safe, comfortable life. But comfort has a way of dulling things, doesn't it? Sometimes, it makes you stop noticing the cracks until someone, or something, forces you to see them. And that someone was him. A boy. A 20-year-old boy. Now, before you start judging me, because I know you will, ask yourself this: have you ever felt invisible? Like the version of yourself you used to be had slowly disappeared, piece by piece, until one day, you didn't even recognize yourself anymore? Have you ever craved something, not just love, but validation, excitement, life, so badly, you were willing to risk everything for it? If you're nodding, then maybe you'll understand why it happened. And if you're shaking your head, well, stay with me. Because this story, it's not what you think it is. It started in the least romantic place you could imagine, a community fundraiser. There were balloons, folding chairs, people I'd known for years who didn't even look up when I walked by. And then, there was him. He was different. He wasn't from my world, and I knew that instantly. But there was something about the way he looked at me. Not like a married woman, not like someone his mother's age. No. He looked at me like I was alive. Have you ever met someone whose presence was so electric, so magnetic, that even when you told yourself to walk away, you couldn't? That's what he was for me. A spark I hadn't felt in years. I know what you're thinking, this is wrong. And believe me, I told myself the same thing. But when was the last time you felt something so powerful it drowned out the voice of reason? When was the last time you took a risk, not because it was safe, but because it made you feel? That's what I did. I felt. And that feeling, well, it was intoxicating. But feelings like that, they come with a price. And believe me, I paid for mine. So, tell me, would you have done the same? Would you have risked it all for a moment that made you feel alive? Or would you have walked away? Comment below, because by the time you hear the rest of this story, I guarantee you'll have an answer. Sometimes, the most profound changes in your life start with the simplest of moments. Not the kind you prepare for or even recognize at first. It's those quiet, unexpected moments that catch you off guard, leaving a mark you can't erase. That's exactly how it began for me. It was a Saturday afternoon at the community center. I'd been volunteering there for years, a place where I knew everyone and everything. Or so I thought. My role was routine, setting up tables, organizing name tags, making polite small talk. Honestly, I'd gotten so used to the predictability of it that I could have done it blindfolded. The room smelled of freshly brewed coffee and overpolished wooden floors. You could hear the faint hum of casual conversations, chairs scraping against the floor, and the occasional laugh echoing from the corner. I should have felt at ease. But that day, something was different. And then, I saw him. He stood at the edge of the room, leaning casually against the wall, arms crossed. He wasn't doing anything to draw attention to himself, but he didn't need to. He didn't belong there, his age alone set him apart from everyone else in the room. He looked young, mid-20s at most, though his presence felt older, more assured. While the others shuffled around in their usual routines, he stood there, watching, observing. At first, I brushed it off. A fleeting thought. But as the minutes passed, I found my eyes drifting back to him. There was something about the way he moved, calm, deliberate, like he wasn't in a rush to be anywhere but exactly where he was. He had this quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't demand attention but earns it anyway. And then, it happened. He caught me looking. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I froze. It wasn't the kind of glance you exchange in passing, polite and forgettable. His gaze held mine, steady, curious. It wasn't invasive or inappropriate. It was intentional. I looked away, my cheeks warming with an embarrassment I couldn't explain. What was I doing? He was just a boy, a stranger. And yet, that look lingered with me long after I turned away. I tried to focus on my tasks. Folding pamphlets, arranging the chairs, anything to distract myself. But no matter how hard I tried, I felt his presence in the room. Not in an obvious way. He wasn't loud or intrusive. But it was like the air shifted wherever he was. Have you ever met someone whose presence felt magnetic? Like they carried some invisible force that drew you in without even trying? And then, as if on cue, he approached me. Need a hand? He asked, his voice smooth, casual. I looked up, startled. I hadn't expected him to speak to me. I managed a smile and nodded, my voice catching in my throat as I said, sure. He reached for the stack of chairs I'd been struggling with, and as he worked beside me, I couldn't help but notice how effortless it seemed for him. He moved with a kind of ease I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just physical, it was in his demeanor, his attitude, the way he made even the mundane seem interesting. We started talking. Small talk, at first, where he was from, how he ended up volunteering that day. I learned he'd recently moved to town and was looking for ways to get involved in the community. His answers were simple, straightforward. But there was a warmth to the way he spoke, like he genuinely cared about the conversation. And then, he asked me something I wasn't prepared for. So, what do you love most about volunteering? It was such a simple question, but it caught me off guard. I paused, searching for an answer, but nothing came to mind. Volunteering had always been something I did out of habit. I'd never stopped to think about why. I gave him a polite smile and said, I guess I like feeling useful. He nodded thoughtfully, like my answer meant something to him. And then he asked, what else makes you feel useful? That question stopped me in my tracks. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. It wasn't just that I didn't have an answer, I hadn't even considered the question before. When was the last time someone asked me something so personal, so direct? When was the last time I'd asked myself? Have you ever been asked a question so simple, yet so profound, that it made you feel exposed? Like someone had peeled back a layer of you that you didn't even know existed? That's what he did. And I didn't know how to handle it. By the time the event was winding down, we'd spent most of the afternoon talking. Not just about volunteering, but about life, books, music, dreams. Things I hadn't talked about in years. He had this way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the room. Like your words mattered. Do you know how rare that is? To feel like someone is truly listening, not just waiting for their turn to speak. As we wrapped up, I found myself smiling in a way I hadn't in a long time. Not the polite, practiced smile I gave to acquaintances, but a real smile. The kind that sneaks up on you when you're not expecting it. And then, as we were saying goodbye, he said something that stayed with me. It was really nice talking to you today, he said, his voice warm and sincere. I should have thanked him and walked away. That's what I should have done. But instead, I hesitated. I looked at him, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. I managed a quiet, you too, but the words felt hollow compared to the weight of what I was feeling. And that's the thing about moments like these, they feel so small at first, so easy to dismiss. But they're not small. They're seeds. And once they're planted, they grow. So let me ask you, if you'd been in my shoes, would you have walked away? Would you have ignored that spark, pretended it didn't mean anything? Or would you have let yourself wonder? Because that's what I did. I wondered. And that wondering, it changed everything. But here's the thing about seeds. They don't just grow quietly. They take root. And before you know it, they consume everything in their path. That's what happened to me. And trust me, it's a story you'll want to hear. So, tell me, what would you have done? Would you have walked away? Or would you have stayed, like I did, and let yourself fall into something you couldn't control? Tell me, because this is only the beginning. At first, it really was nothing. Just small talk, the kind you have with someone you meet in passing, about books, about music, about the way life seems to surprise you when you least expect it. But it didn't stay that way. It was subtle at first, like a breeze that gradually grows stronger. We started crossing paths more often. At the community center, in coffee shops, even at random places I never thought I'd see him. And every time we met, it felt natural, like it was supposed to happen. One day, after a meeting at the center, he offered to walk me to my car. It was late, the kind of night when the air feels still and heavy, and the streetlights cast long shadows. We walked in silence at first, the kind that wasn't awkward but comfortable, like we'd done it 100 times before. And then, just as we reached my car, he said something that stopped me in my tracks. I really enjoy talking to you, he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. I didn't know what to say. I smiled, thanked him, brushed it off like it didn't mean anything. But inside, my heart was racing. Why? Why was my heart racing over something so simple, so innocent? But was it innocent? Was it really? The next time I saw him, he wasn't hesitant anymore. He was confident, direct, in a way that made me both nervous and excited. We started spending more time together, not intentionally, at least not at first. But somehow, we always found excuses. A coffee after the event to talk about the fundraiser. A walk around the block to discuss plans for the next week. Harmless things. At least, that's what I told myself. But the conversations, they weren't harmless. They were deep, real, the kind of talks that make you forget the rest of the world exists. He asked me questions no one had ever asked. What did you want to be when you were younger? What's the one thing you regret not doing? He wanted to know me, not the version of me everyone else saw, but the real me. And I told him. I told him things I hadn't even admitted to myself. About the dreams I'd let go of, the parts of me I'd buried to keep my life together. He listened, really listened, in a way that made me feel like I mattered. Like I was more than just a wife, a mother, a volunteer. And then, it happened. The moment everything shifted. It was a message. Just a simple text, thinking of you. It came late at night, long after my husband had gone to bed, and I remember staring at it for what felt like hours. Thinking of me? Why? What did he mean? I could have ignored it. I should have ignored it. But instead, I replied, thinking of you too. That was the beginning of the late-night conversations. The kind where you lose track of time, where one message turns into 20, and suddenly, it's 2 in the morning, and you're lying in bed with a smile on your face, wondering how someone can make you feel so alive through a screen. He made me feel things I hadn't felt in years. He told me I was beautiful, that I was smart and funny and worth knowing. He saw me in a way no one else did, and I couldn't get enough of it. But it wasn't just about me. He opened up too, in ways I don't think he'd ever done with anyone else. He told me about his fears, his insecurities, the dreams he was afraid to chase. He trusted me. And that trust. It was intoxicating. We both knew it wasn't right. We said it out loud, more than once. This can't happen, I'd tell him, and he'd nod, agree, say all the right things. But then, he'd look at me, and all the logic, all the reason, would disappear. It was like gravity. No matter how hard we tried to fight it, we kept being pulled back together. There was one night I'll never forget. We'd gone for a walk, just a walk, nothing more. Or at least, that's what I told myself. It was cold, and I remember shivering, and without thinking, he took off his jacket and draped it over my shoulders. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt so intimate, so personal, that I couldn't breathe. And when I looked up at him to thank him, he was already looking at me. We can't, I whispered, more to myself than to him. I know, he said. But he didn't move. Neither did I. And in that moment, I knew. We were already too far in. But let me ask you this, if you were in my shoes, if someone made you feel more alive than you'd felt in years, could you have walked away? Could you have looked them in the eye and said no? Because I couldn't. I didn't. And that choice, it came with consequences. We started finding excuses to see each other more often. Lunches that lasted too long, conversations that grew deeper, touches that lingered just a second too long. Every time we said goodbye, I'd tell myself it would be the last time. And every time, I'd find myself right back there, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. It wasn't just about the excitement, the thrill of something new. It was about connection. About being seen, being heard, in a way I hadn't been in years. He made me feel alive. But at what cost? We both knew the risks. We both knew it couldn't last. But knowing and doing are two very different things, aren't they? So tell me, if you'd felt what I felt, if you'd experienced a connection so powerful it drowned out everything else, what would you have done? Would you have stopped? Or would you have let yourself fall, even knowing there was no safety net? Because that's what I did. I fell. And the ground came rushing up faster than I ever could have imagined. But here's the thing about falling, you don't feel the impact until it's too late. And trust me, the impact, it was devastating. Stay with me, because this story is far from over. They say secrets have a way of coming out, no matter how carefully you guard them. And the thing about secrets? They don't just hurt you. They take aim at everything around you, your life, your family, your reputation. And when mine came to light, it didn't just shatter my world. It obliterated it. It started with a single message. A careless, thoughtless mistake. I'd always been careful, deleting every text, every call log, every trace of him from my phone. But that night. I don't know. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was reckless. Or maybe, deep down, I wanted to be caught. The message wasn't even scandalous, at least not on the surface. It was simple, casual, I miss you. 4 little words. 4 words that changed everything. I'd fallen asleep with my phone on the nightstand. My husband, lying beside me, had gotten up to get water. I didn't even hear him come back. But I woke to the sound of silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, charged. And when I opened my eyes, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, my phone in his hand. "Who's this?" he asked, his voice calm, too calm. I sat up, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would burst. I tried to think, to come up with an excuse, a lie, anything. But I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my mind blank. "Who is he?" he asked again, this time louder, angrier. There's something terrifying about a man who rarely gets angry, finally losing his temper. My husband wasn't the shouting type, but that night, his voice echoed through the house. And I just sat there, frozen, unable to look at him. And then he said the words I'd been dreading, "How long? How long?" How could I even begin to answer that? How could I explain that it wasn't about time, that it was about something deeper, something I couldn't put into words? But he wasn't looking for an explanation. He was looking for the truth. And I couldn't give it to him. He threw the phone onto the bed and stormed out of the room. I sat there, staring at it, at the words glowing on the screen, "I miss you." 4 words that had brought everything crashing down. The next morning, he didn't say a word to me. He didn't need to. The silence was deafening. He left for work without even looking at me, and as soon as he was gone, I broke down. I called him, the boy. I told him what had happened, my voice shaking, tears streaming down my face. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "I'm so sorry." That was all he could say. What else was there? But sorry wasn't going to fix it. Sorry wasn't going to put my life back together. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. My husband didn't keep it to himself. How could he? He was hurt, betrayed, and he needed someone to talk to. Unfortunately, that someone was his best friend, and his best friend told his wife, and before I knew it, everyone knew. The look started first. At the grocery store, at the school pickup line, even at the community center. People who used to smile and wave now averted their eyes, their faces tight with judgment. And then, the questions began. Whispered, of course, but loud enough for me to hear. Is it true? How could she? What kind of woman does something like that? I wanted to scream at them, to tell them they didn't understand, that they had no right to judge me. But what would have been the point? They'd already made up their minds. To them, I wasn't a person anymore. I was a scandal. A cautionary tale. And then, the worst part. My children. At first, they didn't know. They were too young to understand the full extent of what was happening, but they could feel the tension. They saw the fights, the tears, the way their father couldn't even look at me. And when the truth finally came out, it was like a knife to the heart. "Why, Mom?" my eldest asked me one night. "Why would you do this to Dad? To us?" How do you answer a question like that? How do you look your child in the eye and explain something you don't fully understand yourself? I tried. I told him I was sorry, that I hadn't meant to hurt anyone. But the look in his eyes, it was the same as his father's. Disappointment. Betrayal. My youngest stopped speaking to me altogether. He wouldn't even stay in the same room as me. Every time I tried to talk to him, he'd get up and walk away. Do you know what it's like to be a stranger in your own home? To walk through the halls of a house you built and feel like an intruder? That's what it felt like. But it didn't stop there. It wasn't just my family. It was my friends, my community. People I'd known for years, who I thought would stand by me, turned their backs. Invitations stopped coming. Phone calls went unanswered. I became a pariah. And the boy? He tried to be there for me, but the guilt was too much. He blamed himself, and I blamed myself, and in the end, there was nothing left to hold on to. Have you ever felt completely alone? Like the world is moving on without you, and you're stuck in this endless cycle of regret and self-loathing? That's where I was. And I had to ask myself, was it worth it? Was that fleeting moment of connection, of feeling alive, worth everything I'd lost? Would you think it was worth it? Looking back, I don't know the answer. Maybe I never will. But what I do know is this, secrets don't stay buried. And when they surface, they take everything with them. So tell me, what would you have done? Would you have told the truth, knowing it would destroy everything? Or would you have lied, knowing the truth would come out eventually anyway? Comment below, because I still don't know what the right answer is. But this isn't where the story ends. It's just the beginning of the fallout. And trust me, the pieces didn't fall gently. They shattered. Stay with me, because there's more to this story than you think. I once read somewhere that the hardest part of waking up isn't realizing you were asleep, it's realizing the dream you were in wasn't real. That's how it felt for me. Like I'd been living in this beautiful, impossible dream, and suddenly, reality came crashing down. And the worst part? I didn't wake up gently. It was like being dragged out of sleep, kicking and screaming, into a world I didn't want to face. For a while, I tried to convince myself that I could hold on to both worlds. That I could keep my life intact, my family, my responsibilities, and still hold on to him. But life doesn't work like that. Secrets don't stay secret forever, and feelings don't stay confined. They spill over, seep into every corner of your life until there's no escaping them. It started to unravel slowly, almost imperceptibly. The moments that used to feel magical, the stolen glances, the whispered conversations, they began to feel heavier. Every message I sent, every time we met, it came with this gnawing sense of guilt. I'd look at him, and for a moment, I'd feel that rush, that spark that had drawn me to him in the first place. But then, I'd feel something else. Something darker. I started to see him differently. Not because he changed, but because I did. I began to notice the things I'd ignored before, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his dreams, the way he spoke about the future with this unshakable optimism. And I realized, he was just a boy. A boy with his whole life ahead of him. And I was dragging him into something he wasn't ready for. What kind of person does that make me? What kind of person takes someone so young, so full of potential, and ties them to something so complicated, so damaging? I remember the moment it truly hit me. We were sitting in a small cafe, tucked away in a corner where no one would see us. He was talking about his plans, his career, the places he wanted to travel, the life he wanted to build. And as I listened, I felt this crushing sense of inevitability. I didn't belong in those plans. There was no place for me in that future. I was a detour, a distraction, a mistake he'd look back on one day and wonder why he ever let himself get caught up in. But here's the thing, I didn't want to be his mistake. I didn't want to be the thing that held him back. Have you ever had to let go of something you wanted so desperately, not because you didn't love it, but because you loved it too much? Because you knew holding on to it would only hurt it in the end? That's what I had to do. And it broke me. The decision didn't come all at once. It wasn't like flipping a switch. It was more like a slow erosion, a gradual wearing down of the fantasy I'd built around us. There were nights I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment we'd shared in my mind. The laughter, the stolen kisses, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. And I'd wonder, couldn't we find a way? Couldn't we make it work, against all odds? But then, reality would creep back in. The looks from my children, the cold silence from my husband, the judgmental stares from people who used to be my friends. And I knew. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep pretending that we were something we weren't. So I made the hardest decision I've ever had to make. I knew I had to let him go. No matter how much it hurts. But how do you say goodbye to someone who's become such a huge part of your life? How do you look them in the eye and tell them it's over when every fiber of your being is screaming at you to hold on? We met one last time. I didn't tell him it was the last time, we just agreed to meet, like we always did. It was raining that day, a soft, steady drizzle that made the world feel smaller, quieter. We sat in my car, the windows fogged up, the sound of the rain filling the silence between us. He knew something was wrong. He could feel it. He kept asking, what's going on? Did I do something? And the way he looked at me, it broke my heart. You didn't do anything, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This isn't your fault. Then why? He asked, his voice cracking. Why are you doing this? How do you explain something like that? How do you tell someone that you're leaving them not because you don't care, but because you care too much? I couldn't find the words. All I could say was, you deserve better. He didn't understand. How could he? He was too young, too hopeful to see what I saw. And when he started to cry, I nearly lost it. Seeing him like that, so vulnerable, so hurt, made me question everything. But I held firm. I had to. I'm sorry, I said, over and over again. I'm so sorry. And then, I did the hardest thing I've ever done. I walked away. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I missed him every second of every day. I missed his voice, his laugh, the way he made me feel like I was someone worth knowing. But I knew it was the right thing to do. Because the truth is, love isn't always enough. Sometimes, love means letting go. Sometimes, it means putting someone else's needs above your own. And as much as I loved him enough to let him go. But let me ask you, could you have done it? Could you have walked away from someone who made you feel alive, who reminded you of everything you'd forgotten about yourself? Or would you have held on, no matter the cost? Because even now, I still wonder, did I make the right choice? Or did I let go of the one thing that truly made me happy? They say time heals all wounds. But does it really? Or do some wounds stay with us forever, a constant reminder of what we had, and what we lost? Tell me, what would you have done? Would you have stayed? Or would you have let go, like I did, and lived with the consequences? Because the truth is, I'm still trying to figure it out. Goodbyes are strange things, aren't they? Sometimes they're loud, messy, filled with words that cut like knives. Other times, they're quiet, almost gentle, but no less painful. Ours was the second kind, a soft ending to something that had burned so brightly it left scars. It was raining that day. A light drizzle, just enough to blur the edges of the world, to make everything feel a little smaller, a little closer. We sat in my car, parked in the same spot where so many of our conversations had started. But this one was different. This one was the end. Neither of us spoke at first. The rain tapping against the windshield was the only sound, and in that silence, everything we didn't want to say hung heavy in the air. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for something, an answer, a reason, maybe even a way to change my mind. But I'd made my decision. Why? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to give him an answer that made sense, one that would make him understand. But how do you explain something that feels impossible to put into words? How do you tell someone that you're letting them go not because you don't love them, but because you do? I don't want to hold you back, I said. You have so much ahead of you, so much to look forward to. And I can't be the one who takes that away from you. He shook his head, tears spilling down his cheeks. You're not holding me back. You're the only thing that makes sense to me right now. And those words, they nearly broke me. Because I knew how he felt. I knew exactly what he meant. But that didn't change the truth. The truth was that we couldn't keep going. The truth was that we had to stop. We cried together, sitting in that car, holding onto each other like we could stop time, like we could make the world go away if we just stayed there long enough. But the world doesn't stop. And eventually, we had to let go. I watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the rain. And as he faded from view, I felt this overwhelming emptiness, like a piece of me had been ripped away. But beneath that emptiness, there was something else. A quiet sense of finality. It was over. And now, I had to figure out how to move forward. The days that followed were some of the hardest I've ever faced. The silence was unbearable. I'd gotten so used to his messages, his calls, the way he made me feel alive, that without him, the world felt hollow. But it wasn't just about missing him. It was about facing everything I'd been avoiding. The damage I'd done, the people I'd hurt. My husband, my children, even myself. I couldn't hide from it anymore. I couldn't pretend it wasn't there. So, I did what I should have done a long time ago. I started to rebuild. It wasn't easy. At first, it felt impossible. How do you apologize for something that's broken so many things? How do you fix relationships when trust has been shattered? I started with my husband. It wasn't about saving our marriage, I knew that might never happen. It was about being honest, about owning my mistakes. I told him everything. Not just about what happened, but about why. About the loneliness, the emptiness, the way I'd lost myself somewhere along the way. And for the first time in years, we really talked. Not as husband and wife, but as two people who had hurt each other, who had lost their way. It didn't fix everything, but it was a start. My children were harder. They didn't want to hear my explanations, and I don't blame them. To them, I was just the person who had broken their family. But I kept showing up. I kept trying. And slowly, over time, we began to find our way back to each other. But the hardest part was forgiving myself. It's easy to get lost in guilt, to let it consume you until you feel like you don't deserve to move on. And for a long time, that's exactly what I did. I replayed every mistake, every hurtful word, every wrong turn, over and over in my mind. But guilt isn't a life sentence. At some point, you have to decide to let it go. Not because you're excusing what you did, but because you can't grow if you're still holding on to it. I started therapy. I started writing. I started looking at myself not as the sum of my mistakes, but as a person who had made them and was trying to do better. And that's what this is about, isn't it? Doing better. Learning from what you've done, and finding a way to move forward. This story isn't about justifying what I did. It's not about asking for forgiveness or trying to make excuses. It's about understanding how easy it is to lose yourself. How easy it is to get caught up in something that feels right in the moment, only to realize later how wrong it was. But it's also about finding your way back. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: we are not our mistakes. We are the choices we make after them. We are the way we pick ourselves up, the way we try to make amends, the way we move forward. So, let me ask you, have you ever felt like you'd lost yourself? Have you ever made a choice you couldn't take back and wondered how you could ever move on from it? What did you do? How did you find your way? Because that's what I'm doing now. I'm finding my way. It's not perfect, and it's not easy. But it's real. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough.